We will begin our webinar in just a few minutes, so stay tuned. Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. We are going to be joined by our guest speaker, Daniel Bonner from Keshet, on Coast to Coast LGBT inclusion. I'm Joy Brand Richardson, coming to you from JCC Association in New York City. Thank you for taking the time today to join this webinar. We're happy to welcome Daniel to our webinar. JCC Association is pleased to announce this newly formed partnership with Keshet. The partnership will not only give JCCs more access to information about programs and content that Keshet provides, but it also helps strengthen our Jewish community by showing the commitment to being welcoming and open to all. And up on the screen you can see the Coast to Coast with our co-branded logos there. A couple of housekeeping notes before we begin our learning. Don't forget to move your coffee or water cups away from the keyboard. You may be able to type in some questions and answers, and we'll talk about that in a minute. You will be muted by the system, but please don't put your phone on hold because we may be able to hear your on-hold music. And before we get started and I turn the controls over to Daniel, I want to make sure that you're comfortable with the dashboard that you see on your screen. On the right, you can see an area that you can type in answers to questions or ask questions. And when our presenter asks a question, there's a raise your hand button that you can click. Looks like a little hand, and that button will allow you to be counted in some of the questions that we'll be asking. At the end of the webinar, there'll be information about taking a brief summary survey, and then you'll also get an email with a survey link, so you can take that webinar survey and give us some of your feedback, as well as some important information that you think that we should consider in moving the partnership forward. Don't forget to check our webinar schedule coming up. All of the webinars can be found on jcca.org. And many of them are recorded and archived on jcca.me, so you can go back in and check those out. And we are recording this webinar. A number of people had contacted us and said that they weren't able to make this time slot, so it will be recorded and archived there. Now I'd like to introduce Daniel. Daniel Bonner grew up in a small conservative synagogue in Southwest Ohio, where he formed a connection between his Jewish identity and the importance of inclusion. He became active in social justice work while at an undergraduate in Lehigh University, a passion which continues at New York University, where he received his master's in higher education administration and student affairs. Using his experiences in social justice education and advocacy, Daniel works with the Jewish communal organizations across the national Jewish community and helps them make concrete strides towards greater LGBTQ inclusion. Now I'd like to introduce Daniel and give him the controls and welcome him to our webinar.
Thank you, Joy. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you today, and thank you all. Thank you again to JCCA for inviting us. We're really thrilled about this particular strategic partnership, so I'm really glad that we can start this conversation with all of you. So just really quickly, just so you know a little bit more about me and the identities that I hold as we enter into this conversation. So I identify as a cisgender gay man. My pronouns are he, him, and his. If any of those words or phrases were new to you, not sure what they meant, don't worry. We will get to that momentarily. And like Joy said, I work with Jewish organizations around the country. And in particular, I've worked with a lot of JCCs across the country in my role at Keshet, even in the almost 2 years that I've been here. Just a really quick overview. It was one of the first, working with the JCC Association was one of the first major projects that I did upon joining Keshet. I flew down to the JCCA conference, led a couple sessions, and since then I've been done a series of webinars with JCCA in 2015 that some of you might have partaken in, and I've also worked with a number of JCCs across the country already, just on a one-on-one basis, because they have LGBTQ individuals in their communities, or they just want to be proactive in working to make their spaces more inclusive. So I'm really thrilled to carry on and doing this work with all of you in the future. Really quick overview of Keshet's work if you're unfamiliar with us. So we work for the full inclusion and equality of LGBTQ Jews and Jewish life. So we support LGBTQ, so that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, and straight ally leaders in communities and across the country. We provide resources, tools, and training, such as a webinar today. And we achieve cultural and institutional change through a number of our programs. Again, some of the programs that I work on more long-term with JCCs, day schools, religious schools, synagogues around LGBTQ inclusion. So training is the bulk of my work. We do work to build community amongst LGBTQ Jews in Boston, in New York City, and San Francisco Bay Area where we have staff based. And then we also do work to create safe spaces for LGBTQ Jewish teens through our Shabbatonim program. We have an East Coast and West Coast Shabbaton in the late winter, early spring that's going to be coming up. So you'll probably be seeing some information about that soon. So if you have queer teens in your community, that's definitely something to think about sending them to and letting them know about it. So just some quick overview of goals for today. We're going to stay pretty broad since we're kicking off this webinar series, and we want to make sure that everybody is at the same page because we did design this for anybody to join regardless of their prior knowledge or exposure to the community. So we're really going to start on some of those 101 basic kind of conversational pieces. So first up, making sure we all understand some of the terms related to the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer communities. Develop a better understanding about both the unique needs of LGBTQ individuals and families, as well as some of the challenges that they face in daily life. Just so I think some of these statistics and some things to keep in mind that you might not be aware of as you're starting to think about what LGBTQ inclusion can look like in your communities. And then lastly, we really want to reflect upon some of the values of inclusion in Jewish communities. What is it about the fact that our communities are Jewish really calls upon us to be inclusive and to build as inclusive as communities as we can. So again, just a reminder of what Joy was just talking about in regards to the platform. We will mostly be using the chat feature just because there's a larger number of us, which is really exciting. It can be a little bit tricky with audio, so we're going to stick with chat feature for now. So one thing I'd like to do, just to kind of start us off getting used to using the platform and just kind of get a sense of who's in the room, is if you could just take the next minute or two and in the chat box, maybe just share one hope or concern you have about LGBTQ inclusion. Only share if you feel comfortable. So I'll be silent for a minute or two just to let folks type things in, and they'll kind of just see, get the temperature of our online space today. So again, if you just want to chat into the chat box, a little short hope or concern you have about LGBTQ inclusion at your JCC.
Daniel, would you like me to read some of them as they come in?
Sure, yeah. Yes, that'd be great.
Okay, so I see Jessica says, I hope to have a better understanding of how to incorporate hold on a second. Jewish values in our straight ally and LGBTQ Jewish community. Daniel Quigley says, I hope that we can continue to grow the relationship and continue to be a positive influence towards acceptance and understanding.
Great.
Rhonda says, she's interested in learning about how to reach out to the LGBT community and foster the sense of inclusion. And I see another one here that's asking how to make LGBTQ inclusion visible in the physical space of the building, like signage and things like that, when our senior team hesitates to put that out in that kind of a message. Mm-hmm. So she says in parentheses, it's also about managing up. Mm-hmm. And then we have another comment that says, I'd like to figure out a way to create a space where LGBTQ individuals feel comfortable coming. I think it's not been fully successful in that regard. Absolutely. And making sure that everyone feels welcome and comfortable in our building. Mm-hmm. Let me see if I can just pick out. Some of them are very similar. Yeah. Handful more. I think that it's important for allies and activists to explore the importance of diverse family units. Pride marches and activities should be something that we take on, focus on, that sometimes they focus on sex rather than families. I think that the Jewish community can have a real role in this form of activism. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And another one says, I hope to gain more knowledge on inclusion practices and terms, and also ensuring our JCC camps and seasonal staff are trained to meet the needs of the teens and others. Great. I think that's a good list. So yeah, thanks everyone for sharing. I know that we won't get to some of your hopes or concerns, but don't worry. We will have additional opportunities to dive into more specific questions and concerns, particular areas of inclusion that you might be interested in. And so we'll definitely take those into account moving forward. And we will have some time to answer questions as well today, but I just don't want anybody to be concerned if we don't get to some of the specific strategies you're talking about, just because we are going to keep this as a broad conversation for now, but we will move in the future, move into more specific kind of concrete steps you can take. Not to say that we won't get into some of those today, but just I want to let people know. But the first one we're going to do is really focus on making sure we all have an understanding of the shared language that we're going to be using. In our experience working with Jewish communities across the country, it's really language is the first barrier to this conversation, right? People hear things in the media, in their relationships, in their interpersonal relationships, their friendships. They might hear have an understanding a little bit about what some of these terms mean, might just hear new terms and not really sure what to make of it, but they might be afraid to ask questions because I recognize the kind of the culture that we live in right now is one where people can be easily outraged, and there isn't always safe spaces to ask questions in a way that is really educational. It's not coming from a place of bad intention, but it's really just coming from a place of curiosity and wanting to understand. So that's what I want to do today, is just to make sure that we're all coming from a place of understanding how these words are operating, how I'm using them, and so that we can all together kind of move forward using them in the same way. So I'm going to start with three kind of topics, three concepts to start off with, and these three concepts are really critical to differentiating what a lot of these terms mean and to really truly building inclusive spaces. So the first word is sex. The first concept is sex. You might also hear sex assigned at birth. The next is gender identity. And then the last is orientation. So these three concepts, identities, terms, are really going to be central to the conversation for the next couple slides. So what do these all mean? So then let's break down some of these concepts. So when I'm referring to somebody's sex or sex assigned at birth, what I'm referring to are people's bodies. We're referring to biological characteristics. And so they're a person's assignment at birth. They're based upon primary and secondary sex characteristics, so things like genitalia, breasts, body hair, chromosomes, hormones, etc. So words in terms you would hear with sex is male, female, or intersex. So intersex is a word to refer to an individual who is born with sex characteristics, both male and female,
an indeterminable combination of the two. So sometimes what happens is if a child is born with an intersex condition, the doctor in consultation with the parents will then determine how they're going to raise that child, what gender they're going to assign to them, and then we'll oftentimes have medical intervention immediately to bring that child's body in line with whatever gender the family decided they're going to raise their child as. Of course, as we understand gender identity, as that child grows up, that could cause problems if that child understands their gender identity to be different than that which they were assigned at birth. So that's just something to keep in mind. So when you hear the word sex, we're talking about bodies, biological, sex assigned at birth, whatnot. And then when we're getting into gender, there are two differentiations I want to make. So there's a difference between gender and gender identity. So when we're talking about gender, gender is a socially constructed set of expectations and norms assigned to people based upon their sex assigned at birth. In Western society, gender is socially constructed around a gender binary where males are men and females are women. So what happens the way our society is structured is a baby is born, a doctor will look at the genitalia of that child, either a sonogram or when the child is born, and say it's a boy or it's a girl. In reality, if we're understanding these concepts as separate as they are, the doctor is actually naming two different things at that moment. That doctor is assigning that child a sex based upon what the doctor sees, and then that doctor is also assigning a gender. So a large part of this conversation is breaking up our assumption that because of somebody's sex, you can then know what somebody's gender identity will be. This concept of a gender binary of they're only men and women is a very Western concept. There are many societies throughout time, a lot of indigenous populations across the globe, where they have more than two genders, where they have up to 5. So this idea that gender is this set in stone, comes from the earth, is really a social construction, and that's something that we all can really start to understand when we think about how gender operates in society, right? When somebody is asked, or an individual is asked what child they're having if they're expecting a child, oftentimes the first question about that child is it a boy or a girl, and then the answer to that will start a whole series of assumptions and expectations that we then will reinforce upon that child. So maybe everything that a boy would get would be blue, and they would get trucks and cars, and girls would be getting dolls and associated with pink. But even though those expectations exist, those expectations also change. So 70 years ago, pink was associated with boys, not girls, right? Our founding fathers of our country wore wigs and high heels. So gender expectations change. That is different than gender identity, which is a person's inner understanding of what gender or genders they belong to or identify with. This is each person's unique knowing or feeling, and is separate from a person's physical body or appearance, so it's oftentimes related. So we're going to, on the next slide, get into some terms that relate to that difference. But just it's important to recognize that gender is a social construct that we as societies have created and perpetuate, but a gender identity is one's inner sense of what gender one is. And then lastly, orientation is a pattern of emotional, romantic, and/or sexual attractions. The sense of one's personal and social identity based on attractions and behaviors expressing them, oftentimes linked to the genders of the person towards one whom feels these attractions. So orientation is really about who we start relationships with, who we fall in love with. It's important to recognize that orientation is not just about sexual attraction, but there are different components to attraction, be it emotional, romantic, spiritual, physical, etc. And so these three concepts are really important to separate from each other, because the way in which our societies are structured is to assume all three of these about an individual. So when I was born, the doctor saw male genitalia, said it's a boy, and then since I was a child, it was assumed I was going to be heterosexual, and then fall in love and start a relationship with a woman because of those two other things about me that was decided upon me at birth. So really, one of the first things that you can do as you're working to create LGBTQ inclusive spaces is making sure that you are separate. You're starting to uncouple these from each other in your mind, and I understand that it's really challenging because we're socialized to think about these things. But the only way that we can work towards making more inclusive spaces is we actively work on our own to really unlearn what we've learned around these concepts and to relearn a new framework. So then what are some of these terms related to these concepts? So These terms are all related to orientation, and the way in which the LGBTQ civil rights conversation has moved in this country, I think terms around orientation are ones that are much more familiar to people. So these are terms like lesbian, a person who identifies as a woman and is primarily attracted to members of the same gender or sex, so a woman who identifies as a woman attracted to other women. Gay has largely become a word people who identify as men attracted to other men. There are some women that use gay to refer to themselves. Gay can sometimes be used as an umbrella term for the entire community, but more and more I think you're seeing gay really exclusively referring to men who identify as men who are attracted to men. And again, there are multiple components of attraction. Bisexual then is an individual who is emotionally, spiritually, physically, and sexually attracted to more than one gender and or sex. It's important to recognize that it's not a 50-50 split. Each individual has their own kind of configuration about how they're attracted to individuals, who they're attracted to what degree, what kind of relationship they might want to be in with that person. It's all up to the individual, but it's an incorrect assumption, and it would be a stereotype to say that it's a perfect 50-50 split. The next one is queer, which is a term that can be a loaded term for some, and I do want to lift up and name the different ways that it's used. So one way that it has become more commonly used is as an umbrella term for the entire lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community. The LGBTQ and the alphabet soup can be a mouthful, and so queer has become an umbrella term to describe the entire community. You would often hear it also in terms of like a political connotation to it, so like queer politics or queer theory, queering something has a political act to it. And it's a term used to describe a sexual orientation that is not straight without indicating the genders of the queer person or the people they are attracted to. So one thing in particular that I think is really important about this word is that it's a word that relates to orientation, but it's a word that does not inherently in its definition have either men or women or you're attracted to one or the other. Because you'll notice the other terms that associate with attraction, inherent in them is this idea of the gender binary. So it's for individuals who that is not the case, and as they understand themselves. Queer is a term that they use, that they have reclaimed to describe that experience, because it has historically been used by some as a slur targeting those who are perceived to transgress the norms of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. So for some individuals in our communities who grow up in a certain time, this is a word that is very negatively charged to them, and they don't want to hear it. They don't really use it in reference to them, and that's okay. That's totally valid. But at the same time, younger people in our communities have reclaimed that word, and so it is important for them to see it. So this is it's a tricky question. It's a tricky thing to navigate. So I generally tell people that if an individual describes himself as queer to you, identifies as queer, that you should be using that term to describe themselves, regardless of how you feel about that word. Because if you do not honor and respect a person's words that they use to describe themselves, then you are not respecting them as a person. Then lastly, straight is a person who is primarily emotionally, spiritually, physically, and sexually attracted towards persons of a different gender and biological sex. Another term for this is heterosexual. So now going into some terms around gender identity. Transgender, trans with an asterisk. This is an umbrella term for anyone who knows themselves to be a gender that is different than the gender they were assigned at birth. This is then complements the term cisgender, which is for a person who is comfortable in the gender they were assigned at birth. It comes from the Latin prefix cis, meaning on the same side. So just to break it down a little bit more for you, I told you all at the beginning that I identify as a cisgender man. So what that means is that when I was born, a doctor, as I said, saw male genitalia and said, it's a boy. As I came to know myself, I never questioned that, and I know myself to be a man. And so since my gender identity is in line with what I was assigned at birth, that experience is called cisgender. In the same situation, if I was born with male genitalia, if I came to know myself as a woman or as not a man, but some kind of combination of genders, I might describe that experience as trans. So some trans people kind of identify as a trans man, trans woman, trans boy, trans girl. They might have a combination. It might vary at different points in our lives. It's a journey. Understanding ourselves is a journey, and it's not our place to place judgment or to tell other people how their journey should be going. It's important to recognize, particularly with the trans community, that not every trans person's story is the same. Not everybody's endpoint is the same. Some trans folks modify their bodies through medical means and some do not. Some might want to but don't have the means to because the process to transition medically and physically is really expensive. So for example, Caitlyn Jenner, if you're familiar with Caitlyn Jenner, pretty famous trans woman at the moment, she is a very rich, white, wealthy woman who has access to a lot of resources to bring her body in line and her presentation and expression into a particular idea of what it means to be a woman for her. And that's wonderful and totally valid for her, but not everybody has that experience or has that same endpoint in mind. So that's just something to understand. It's a very personal journey. It's never appropriate to ask a trans person about their genitalia. That's a very private question. If there are particular questions you have around that, we can get into those. But that's just something to keep in mind. Some other terms around gender identity you might hear, particularly amongst younger people. Gender nonconforming, that's more a gender identity used to describe people whose gender expression does not align with societal expectations based on their perceived gender. So maybe they are more feminine or more masculine. Gender queer is another gender identity used by a person that self-define their gender as queer or non-normative, somebody who's chosen gender identity is neither man nor woman. It goes beyond the gender. They reject the gender binary, combination of genders. Again, these are terms that you will be using if somebody identifies them as such to you. It would not be a correct assumption to assume that somebody identifies as genderqueer just by looking at them. It's really something you should be thinking about only if they disclose their identity to you. And so this graphic, called the genderbread person, is hopefully one that can be used to kind of distill a lot of what I just talked about, and I understand that it was probably a lot, and maybe it was a lot of information at once. But this graphic can maybe help you understand what some of these mean, how they relate to each other, and maybe understand the socialization, these newer socializations in a more inclusive way. So we have identity at the top, gender identity, represented in the brain. Our brain is our seat of who we are, and our gender identity is very central and integral to who we are as people. Moving down, the heart represents attraction. Attraction and orientation are about who we fall in love with, who we're attracted to. So you can think about attraction just as you would when you think about the heart symbolically. Then sex, biological sex. Again, genitalia oftentimes, for good or for bad, is the lowest common denominator, what we think about. And so that's what, when you think about biological sense, you can think about that. And then lastly, the dotted line around the genderbread person represents expression. And so it's how we present ourselves, how we present our gender, our action, our dress, our demeanor, our name, our pronouns, things like that. And it's really important to really understand these terms not as binaries and as boxes, but rather as spectrums, which you can see on the screen as well. So gender identity, this spectrum of womanness and manness, rather than a box of man and a box of woman. Same with biological sex, gender expression, orientation, etc. And again, I saw there was a question about this, but just so I can tell everybody, in case you didn't see it, these slides will be sent out after the presentation, so you will have access to these as well. So that's a really brief overview of terms and terminology and concepts. I'm sure many of you have questions. Again, there'll be some time at the end for us to ask questions, and I'll provide my email address if you have a specific question you would rather do offline, we can do that as well. But I'm going to keep moving just for sake of time. So then, now that we've identified the terms and have a better understanding about who we're talking about, I do want to lift up a couple of statistics and just really talk about what some of the needs are about the queer community, because I do think that they are unique. The LGBTQ community is one of the most marginalized communities in the country in terms of protections that the state offers, the country offers, and really the visibility of the community is a relatively recent phenomenon, really, when you think about how quickly the LGBTQ civil rights movement has gone. So recently, maybe some of you have seen it in the New York Times, the Center for Disease Control has recently published a study. It was the first time where they did a study for young people where they did ask about sexual orientation. They didn't ask about gender identity. So the LGBTQ teens, kind of generalization, or the lumping is a bit of a generalization, but I can tell you that for LGBTQ folks, these statistics, for trans folks, I should say, these statistics are going to be higher. So for LGBTQ teens and youth, they were reported that they were 3 times more likely than straight students to have been raped. They are more likely to have skipped school far more often because they didn't feel safe. At least a third had been bullied on school property. They were 2 times more likely to have been threatened or injured with a weapon on school property. They're more than 40% reported they had seriously considered suicide, and 29% made attempts to do so in the past year. I can tell you that for trans youth, that number is closer to 50%, if not over 50%, of having seriously considered suicide, and the number of having attempted to do so is also higher. And there are greater usage of illegal drugs. 6% reported using heroin. These are really sobering statistics, right? Especially when we think about our organizations, our Jewish communal life is largely centered around, a lot of Jewish communities are centered around young people and the youth in our community, and to think about that these are the things that LGBTQ youth are dealing with. They might not always be vocalizing it because the social pressures, the social cost of vocalizing it, of asking questions, of openly identifying, even in a time like this where we have seen a lot of strides in LGBTQ inclusion, these are still happening, and these are still life or death decisions that young people are having to make. And there are still more than 40% of them, having lived the brief time on this planet already understand that this world is not made for them. That the institutions that are built to keep them safe they do not see them as having them in mind. And so really it's making sure that we're creating spaces so that not only LGBTQ adults feel included, but that the young people in our community know that they are loved and supported and welcome in our communities no matter what. I also then do, on the flip side, wanted to bring in some statistics about gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender elders. So if you're unfamiliar with SAGE, SAGE works specifically with the LGBTQ aging and elder population. And so for them, I do think that they themselves also have some unique needs. So 40% of LGBTQ older adults ages 60 to 75 say their healthcare providers don't know their sexual orientations. Again, these were individuals who grew up at a time when the conversation about LGBTQ inclusion was very different. When there would have been, there would have been laws on the books that prohibited certain types of sexual behavior, where they were even more marginalized than they already are, where there were not media figures that provided positive role models. In fact, I would say that in the media, it was more common to see those negative stereotypes. I think there's that infamous commercial from the 40s or 50s, I can't remember which decade, of kind of that beware of the gay man as a pedophile kind of stereotype. So these are people that lived through that and internalized those messages. And so they might have a tendency to hide it and to not feel like they can live openly. And 40% of LGBTQ older people say their support networks have become smaller over time compared to 27% of non-LGBTQ people. 34% of LGBTQ older people live alone compared to 21% of non-LGBTQ people. 32% of older people are concerned about being lonely and growing old alone as compared to 19%. 25% of transgender older adults report discrimination when seeking housing. And again, another thing to keep in mind is this is also an age cohort that lived through the AIDS crisis. That age group lost a lot of members because of the inaction of the government and just the nature of the crisis. And so that's something else to keep in mind. So it's important to keep all members of our communities in mind so we can serve them. So those are just some statistics about the community. Some other things to keep in mind. I focus just on teens and elders, but the LGBTQ community is a diverse conglomeration of identities whose programming needs are just as diverse. And just as I was saying, I think that a lot of our Jewish organizations and even our programming are structured to think, talk around families. But not every LGBTQ individual, LGBTQ couple, or relationship are going to look to have families, but they still want to be involved. And so thinking about other types of programs you can create. But at the same time, LGBTQ individuals share similar hopes, dreams, concerns. They want to find community. They want to make friends. They want to learn how to be better partners, parents, children, to elder parents. So they do have a lot of very similar needs. And so it's very important that when we do those kind of programming, that they take a large, diverse audience into account. Just as I was saying before on the slide prior, youth need opportunities to explore themselves in a safe place. So like if you plan on doing romantic themed matchmaking events, it's critical to make sure you make space for LGBTQ folks. It's important to both create programming that speaks directly to the needs of the queer community by maybe doing specific programming groups or programming nights for them, but also making sure that in the larger community programs that it is inclusive enough that queer folks feel included. And sometimes, in order to be inclusive, it means completely rethinking a program rather than trying to fit inclusion into an existing program. Sometimes it takes a little bit of creativity to do something differently, and that's okay. And sometimes it'll make it better. Re-enliven a program that maybe has been going on for a while. So this was just a quick overview of some things you should be thinking about as you start priming your communities for these types of programming. But of course, we could go into more concrete in depth if we had the time. So then the last kind of 10 minutes or so, I do want to focus on what is it specifically about the Jewish community that really calls upon us to be inclusive spaces. So at Keshet, we have a really amazing resource that I like to use called 7 Values for an Inclusive Jewish Community. They're respect, peace in the home, in God's image, communal responsibility, guarding one's use of language, love your neighbor as yourself, and solidarity. These come in the form of a poster, and if I could show you the poster, you would see that there's a little write-up for each value, but nothing inherently on this poster speaks directly to LGBTQ inclusion. Sure, our logo is on it, it's written in rainbow colors, but the values themselves are written in a speak from inclusion in its broadest way. I think that's really important because, as Joy said at the beginning, I grew up in a very small conservative Jewish community. Conservative, closer to conservadox. I did not have a lot of Jewish people around me. I was one of a handful of Jewish kids in my class of 600. So it was a very different kind of experience for me than growing up maybe in a Jewish community on the East Coast. But I still feel like I learned these values in my Jewish education, and that these values are values that form the bedrock of the work that I do in social justice. Because I learned that as Jews, we value these things. We value respect. We value the belief that everybody is made in God's image. We feel that we have a responsibility to each other, to our brothers and sisters, and our siblings, and our community, and our tribe. We have a responsibility to stand in solidarity with each other, to guard our use of language. So if we say that we value these things as a community already, that means they call upon us to pray with our feet and to actually do them. So if we say that we value respect, that means we have to treat people with respect, and part of treating people with respect is making sure we're using the appropriate pronouns, right? If we value guarding one's use of language, that means we need to use the appropriate name when referring to people. That means we need to apologize when we make mistakes. That means we need to use the terms that people use to describe themselves. If we love your neighbor as yourself, that means we need to really think about our own identities and our own journeys, and how do we come to this? What do we bring to our community, and how do we want to be treated so then we can treat other people the same way? Framing from a place of our values is a really useful tool that all of you can use as you start this conversation in our community, maybe with your board or your senior leadership or the larger community of parents, maybe in your day camp community, for example. If you frame it like we are a community that says we value these 4 things, and maybe some of your JCCs have those values that are very particular to your community, I have a very strong gut feeling that those values that you lift up, even if they're not named here, would probably call upon you to be inclusive. So really framing it from that kind of a place is also really beneficial. You also have the JCC Movement Statement of Principles for the 21st century, which I would argue also calls upon us to be inclusive of LGBTQ individuals. So model a world in which more than ever Jewish wisdom is valued. So if Jewish wisdom values inclusion, then I think lifting that up and finding those examples, differences are respected, communities are built, creativity is encouraged, and aspirations are realized in exciting, powerful new ways. I would argue that all of these things call upon us to create LGBTQ inclusive spaces from a place of our values. And it's not just our values, it's also in our tradition. So I wanted to highlight a couple of really cool examples. They're cool for me because when I was growing up in my synagogue life and in my Jewish education, we didn't really get into a lot of the Talmud, but there are examples in the Talmud of the rabbis talking amongst themselves and trying to figure out how to understand human diversity in ways that we would describe it as gender diversity. They wouldn't. Of course, there's a little bit of anachronisms to put modern concepts back into the ancient world, but there are examples in our tradition of beyond just male and female. I mean, I think that's important to recognize, because I know for myself, when I was in Sunday school and religious school, when we kept studying the same stories, we kept studying the same holidays, to a certain extent, I think because our traditions are so old, there's a tendency to maybe think of them as set in stone, there's very important value in tradition, but I think it's valuable to lift up other parts of our tradition that maybe don't fit the narrative that we often always hear. So for example, in the Talmud and the Mishnah, the rabbis talked about the androgynos, a person who's both male and female sex characteristics. This person is understood as someone who both has a penis and has some female sex traits. It was referenced 149 times in the Mishnah and Talmud, 350 in classical Midrash. The Tumtum, a person whose sexual characteristics are indeterminate or obscured, they have indeterminate genitalia. Again, look at the number of times it was mentioned in the Mishnah and Talmud, and that shouldn't be 3,000, that should be 335. Alinot, a person who identified as female at birth but develops male characteristics at puberty and isn't fertile. Again, referenced a number of times throughout the Mishnah and Talmud. And the Saris, a person who is identified as male at birth but develops male characteristics at puberty or later. Can be naturally a Saris or become one through human intervention, such as eunuch, again, mentioned many times. And so then let's see some of these in action, right? So let's look at the very first time humans are mentioned as being created in Bereshit. So God created the first Adam, the first human being, in God's own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, God created them. So how did the rabbis understand this? Because as many of us know, the next time that humans are mentioned as being created, it's maybe the more common story of Adam came first, was given the garden to name the creatures, he was lonely, and then Eve came from his rib and became his partner, etc. But really the first time that humans are mentioned as being created, that first being was created in the image of God, and that being in of itself had both male and female characteristics. So then the rabbis in the Midrash understood this to mean that the first Adam was then created androgynos, so somebody that had both male and female sexual characteristics. So what could that mean then for our community if we lifted this story up? If we drew wisdom from this story, if not only is God, is Adonai a being beyond our human understandings of gender, beyond a gender binary, a gender queer kind of being, and then the first Adam is created in that image. What does that say for gender inclusion in our communities, for inclusion of trans and gender nonconforming folks, right? So this example, I think, is a really powerful one of, from the very beginning, we as Jews believe that all humans are made in the image of God, regardless of their male or female traits. Here's another example. So here's an example of Abraham and Sarah. So I'm not going to go through the whole dialogue, but basically, you can see on the screen is the rabbis are trying to understand the Talmud, how Abraham and Sarai went from being infertile to being able to have children, right? So in our tradition, we have two really important figures that were known by a certain name, went through transformation, and then were known and celebrated as their authentic selves in a new way, right? Their bodies underwent a transformation, their names were different. So even that, what could we draw from our experiences with this to speak to trans experiences or trans inclusion and lifting up those kind of voices in our communities? Because again, even the rabbis were saying Abraham and Sarah were originally tumtums, right? And our mother Sarah was an alonit. So looking back, again, these were terms that went beyond just man and woman that the rabbis were talking about. And then lastly, the Saris, this comes from Isaiah. There's a bit of it that says, and for the Saris who keeps my Sabbath, who have chosen what I desire, and who hold fast my covenant. So a Saris who upholds the tradition, God will give him a monument and a name better than sons and daughters, right? And that's a pretty remarkable statement, because what is one of the first commandments in the Torah is be fruitful and multiply, right? But here we have an example of our tradition of this individual who is a Saris, who does not have a penis, who identified as male at birth but develops male characteristics at puberty later. This individual, the rabbi still understood that this person was going to be honored by God, and so how could we as humans not honor this person, right? So these are three really cool and really powerful, I think, examples from our own tradition that really speak to this. So I'm curious, I have some questions on the screen, so I'd be curious if folks want to have some reaction to this. What do you think some of these texts say about gender diversity, or do you see some challenges created by reading them? Do they excite you? What is your first reactions to seeing them? Are you familiar with them? I'm kind of just curious if you want to put in the chat box what you thought about some of these texts. Are they new to you? Just take a minute or two, and then Joy, if anybody types anything in, if you wanted to say it out loud. And maybe some of these questions are a little bit too broad, so I'm curious to hear kind of what are your thoughts on using some of Jewish values or Jewish tradition around this framing on inclusion. Do you think it will be beneficial for your community?
So there's a question that says, what does the Orthodox community say about your interpretation of these texts?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because there are some that would argue that these are not appropriate usage of these texts. And so maybe this would not be a beneficial tool for that particular community. But I do think that there are some communities where the reading of text and the infusion of and wrestling with text in this way, I think, is inherent to who we are as Jews, right? It's in our name. It's who we are as a people. So text isn't always going to be an example, or isn't going to be salient for your community, but values are maybe going to be more salient. And so that's something to keep in mind when you're framing this conversation with your community, is understanding who's in it and what's going to be relevant for them, and making sure that you have the appropriate ways to respond. I did not study Talmud, and so I would not be the right person to get into a really deep conversation about what some of these mean. I think for me, somebody that is not as learned in the text, I get really excited by these, because for me, it brings new light to examples in our tradition that go just beyond this gender binary. And even if they aren't perfect, and even if they aren't exactly what I think I'm framing them to be, I do think that they illuminate examples where it was not clear cut. It was not man and woman. There was some area of gray, and how can we make space for that? Because rabbis in the past have made space for that.
There's another comment here that says, I've never thought about Abraham, and Sarai, Sarah, change as being based on their sexual identity, and that this person just felt it's a very interesting concept.
Yeah, again, I think that's something that when you think about Jewish tradition in general, there's a resource that we have on our website, which I'll talk about in a moment, called Torah Queries, which is a collection of reflections on Torah, but told from a queer perspective. And for me, growing up in the Jewish community, and growing up, anybody growing up, really seeks to see themselves reflected in the world that they're navigating. So for me, in the Jewish community and in media in general, I crave to find myself. And so I would look for anything that really spoke to my experiences. And so maybe looking back, maybe as a kid, and I heard about Esther coming out as a Jew, maybe part of me could say, what would it look like to, as a community, talk about the power of Esther coming out as her authentic self as a Jew, relate to the power of coming out as our authentic self in our modern times? What does that mean? What can we draw upon those experiences from each other? Or Joseph, right? Joseph is described in the Torah in ways that we as a modern audience would code him as the stereotypes of a gay man, as an effeminate gay man. What would it look like to talk about the dangers of bullying LGBTQ youth by using this example from our tradition, right? So I think even though our tradition was and the texts were written in times where terms like gay and straight and trans didn't exist, I do think that we can draw wisdom upon and look upon our traditions from a new perspective to enrich them and enlighten them and bring other people into our traditions. Were there any other comments?
Yeah, I think there's a few more here. I think it would be affirming for trans young people to know that these texts are part of the Jewish tradition and that they have been seen in the Talmud. It's fascinating that I never learned about this diversity of gender in the Talmud before. It's not typically emphasized in Jewish education. It makes me feel that Judaism has a sensitivity and nuances to gender.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that that's something about Judaism, that there's a tension, right? Like so many of our rituals are gendered. Hebrew is a gendered language, but at the same time, and yes, I do not want to sugarcoat it and say that our tradition is perfect as it relates to gender diversity. There is a lot to cover in a lot of different ways, just as there is for everything else. But I think what's important is that, just as that person hit on the head, one of the ways in which our spaces are not inclusive of LGBTQ individuals is that our narratives and our stories are not told and are not lifted up as equal value to the dominant narrative. So this is an example of that, right? There are modern readings of modern reflections from queer individuals on sacred texts, or the love song between David and Jonathan is, I think, a perfect example. If I don't remember being read that in my synagogue growing up, but I can guarantee that if I did, I would say, this is me. I finally found somebody that I can relate to, and that would have been a really powerful moment for me. But if a community doesn't feel that they don't want to lift that up because they don't want to open up the questions to, are they gay, or what does that mean, or they don't want to feel like that they are mainstreaming it, then that is a way in which we are not including the voices of LGBTQ individuals. We're silencing their experiences. So I think by bringing these examples, while they're not perfect, and yes, I think they can be critiqued from the way in which I've talked about them, I do think it creates a dialogue of, what does our tradition say, where can we make space, and it's not as clear-cut as maybe we thought.
And there's one more comment that says that your examples seem to focus on biological sex rather than gender, and earlier you explained this in the webinar, and it's interesting to see how this was really related to biological sex rather than gender. It's something we need to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, the concept of gender diversity and sex as we understand it is not the same as it was in the ancient world, or in the hundreds of years ago where these conversations were happening. So it's not a perfect analogy, again. And so I think that is important to keep in mind, is that we're not talking about a perfect A equals B kind of situation, but it's really, what can we learn from the ways in which the rabbis were talking about these issues that can make space for other kinds of conversations to happen. Great. Okay, so that was a really great, that is a resource that you can find on our website if it was something that was really interesting to you, that you maybe want to bring back to your larger community. At Keshet, one of the resources that I want to offer all to you is our resource library. This is what it looks like, our landing page. It's a searchable database. We have over 650 entries that you can search by topic, by media type, by grade level. If you're looking for activities to do with your young children or with your high school students, if you're looking for particular authors or particular holidays, you can find that all there. It's free to use. Just go to keshetonline.org. We just ask that you put credit the original source, either us or the author that created it. And you'll notice on the left side of your screen, there are a couple other resources. Torah queries I mentioned. The Purim Superhero is a really great book that's a LGBTQ Jewish resource for young people. There's another book coming out called The Flower Girl World Celery that's about a little girl who goes to her aunt's wedding and she's getting married to another woman, and it's a Jewish ceremony. 7 Jewish Values poster, that's what the poster looks like. Torah Queries is a book. We have posters. You can put up posters in somebody asked earlier about how can you set up the physical space to make it more inclusive. Putting up visible markers of inclusion. So the 7 Jewish Values poster, the Keshet Safe Zone sticker, making sure your media libraries have books and movies and resources around LGBTQ inclusion. So Hineni is a documentary about a young Jewish woman, queer woman, who created a gay-straight alliance at her Jewish pluralistic day school. The Hineni posters are lifting up those experiences of LGBTQ Jews in our community. So Harvey Milk is one of them, the first out gay man politician who also was Jewish. Kate Bornstein is another LGBTQ Jewish individual. There's so many more as well. But these are just a few of the resources that I wanted to highlight with the resource library, Leslie Newman, and then that's our website, keshetonline.org. That is my email address, daniel@keshetonline.org. And so now that we have about 10 minutes, I do want to open it up for, or 5 minutes I should say, for some questions that people have. Like I said, please feel free to email me if you have a more specific question or you're looking for particular resources or a particular issue has arisen at your JCC. I'd be happy to talk to you. But just right now, I'd love to answer any questions that might have come up.
We had an earlier question that someone was saying that they were from Canada, and they wanted to know if some of the statistics that you had quoted, both around teens and the schools and being bullied, as well as the older adult statistics, if that correlates to Canada.
Yeah, I'm going to go on a limb and say, if not perfectly, then yes. I would, in general, the world at large is not one that is particularly friendly to the queer community. I think Canada, in some respects, has the stereotype of maybe being a little bit farther along on certain capacities. I would say that while they might not be identical, I think it's safe to assume that they face very similar challenges. Just because it's a Western society that's structured in a certain way with certain institutions and the way in which the media operates, I think it's very similar. So I would say it's probably an analogous situation, if maybe different in somewhat. And again, probably depending on what part of the country they're living in, just as my experience growing up in more rural Midwest is very different than growing up on the East Coast, I would assume very similar kind of differences would exist in Canada, and the same with elders as well. Again, a lot of the statistics really speak to, I think, society at large. And I think society at large is definitely moving to a place of better visibility and inclusion, but the messages are still being put out there that you are other, that you are different, that you are not, this world was not made for you, and that's a really hard thing to realize as a kid. That's something that I realized at a young age. Like, I knew from when I was 7 years old that I wanted to put the blue token in my car with me on the game of life, you know, where you get married and you have to stop at the church and put the pink token. I knew that from a very young age that if I put blue in there that I would be in trouble. And that's a really sobering thing for a child to learn. I think maybe some Jewish young people learn that when they maybe learn what it means to be Jewish in this world. But I think more so with the LGBTQ community, no matter where they are, because they're still having to hear the news reports from around the world of where people are still put to death for being queer. That still happens, and in countries that are considered civilized, this is the conversation that's ongoing, and living in the media, the world that we live in, where we're always connected, they're absorbing those messages whether they live in their country or not.
I see another question that asks, do you have any resources that include Yiddish queer theater from the early 20th century?
That's a wonderful question. I do not know off the top of my head. If we do not have any, I'm sure we could locate some. I'm not sure if they're looking specifically for queer-related or just in general, but I love theater, and I love the connection between musical theater and Yiddish theater and just the historical connection between it. So if that person would like to email me specifically, I'd love to learn more about their question or what their needs are.
Okay. There's another question that says, does JCC Association have policies for LGBTQ issues, things like bathroom, locker rooms, gyms, sports leagues, camps, bunks? The answer is no. At this time, we do not have specific policies. Keshet is helping guide individual JCCs as they navigate this entire new world that seems to be sprouting up all around us. And certainly reach out to Daniel and his team for more information about those kinds of issues.
Yeah, we've been working with a few JCCs around the country around policy, and we have permission from many of them to share those. So if you're looking for one in particular, like I have a sample locker room policy from the JCC in Asheville, North Carolina, that we were given permission to share. So yeah, if you want to email me separately, I can send you one example that we have.
Okay, and I see a couple more questions specific to that, things with locker room statistics and situations and changing rooms and things like that.
So it definitely, I would not say in the future for a locker room specific or trans specific, I'm sure that will be a topic we'll cover in future webinars. Just really quickly, I can tell you, just since it is a very hot topic right now, there has never been an instance of a trans individual being prosecuted or being charged with any kind of violence in the bathroom against somebody else. In fact, it is more likely that they are the ones being targeted for violence. And I think that the questions around bathroom inclusion, when we really get down to it, are what does our society say about certain bodies? And male bodies are seen as aggressors and female bodies are seen as victims and passive. And so what does that mean? So I think there's a lot of different things we can decouple from each other because the reality is that trans folks are more vulnerable in bathrooms than cisgender folks are if trans folks are using it.
Great. Well, Daniel, I'd love to thank you for this wonderful time that we spent together. There are a few other questions, and I would suggest, since we are out of time, that those people that have questions that weren't answered on the airwaves, that you reach out to Daniel through his email address and go on to keshetonline.org so that you can find some of those specific documents and helpful pieces of material. There's blogs there, there's different links to holiday guides, there's all kinds of information on inclusion and different downloadable materials that you can access as well. And as I said at the top of the time together, we're very excited to be able to partner with Keshet to be able to bring this wonderful resource to our Jewish community centers. And we'd like your input into how we can address other issues that you're dealing with at your JCC. So certainly when you get the survey, please do answer the survey questions and let us know what other things that you're thinking about. And if you want to email me, it's joy@jcca.org. Because we are starting to think about the professional conference and how we can bring Keshet along in the professional conference and what kinds of workshops we want to hold at the professional conference as well. So thank you, Daniel, for giving us this really great things to think about. As I said earlier, this is the first in a webinar series that we will be offering, and we will be putting out some other information about upcoming webinars and topics. So that's terrific. Thanks so much. In general, our next webinar will be brought to you by JCC Association will be next Wednesday, which is September 28th. It's on the topic of the new Department of Labor regulations, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and that is something that's going to be affecting all JCCs beginning December 1st. So if you or somebody in your JCC spread the word, tell them to log on so that they can get the latest information from one of our lawyers. That would be great. You can check out jcca.org for a complete list of the upcoming training opportunities. And as I mentioned, there's lots and lots of webinars that have been archived on jcca.me. So as you move forward, check those out, use them as training materials at your JCCs. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted on jcca.me probably by the end of the week, along with some of the support materials that Keshet has provided us and that Daniel gave us today. So thank you again, Daniel. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for participating, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.